Paradoxes of meditation. I'm not supposed to tell you about my first big success at meditating. The reason is that there isn't supposed to be success at meditating. As any good meditation teacher will tell you, if you talk about meditation in terms of success or failure, you're misunderstanding the whole point of meditation and what it is. Here I must depart from orthodoxy. I wouldn't advocate meditating if I didn't think there was something people could achieve by it. And if people don't achieve that something, well, that would constitute failure, right? As in the opposite of success. Granted, it may be best for people who are meditating to not think about succeeding, but that's because thinking about succeeding gets in the way of success. And granted, if you do achieve meditative success, that may lead to a new frame of mind that is less caught up in the pursuit of success than your old frame of mind, less relentlessly focused on achieving certain kinds of distant material goals, more aware of the here and now. In sum, you can best achieve success at meditation by not pursuing success, and achieving this success may mean caring less about success. At least success is as conventionally defined. If this sounds unbearably paradoxical, maybe you should quit reading here, because this won't be the last time we find paradox in Buddhist practice or Buddhist teachings. Then again, there are paradoxical things in modern physics. An electron is both a particle and a wave, and modern physics works fine. So you might as well keep reading. Anyway, before I violate protocol by telling you about my first big success as a meditator, I have to commit another violation of protocol by noting what a naturally bad meditator I am. That you shouldn't talk about how bad you are at meditating is a straightforward corollary of the axiom that there's no such thing as succeeding or failing at meditating. And if I'm violating the axiom, I might as well violate this corollary. So here goes. Suppose you ranked all the people in the world in terms of their likelihood of picking up mindfulness meditation easily. Sitting down, focusing on the breath, and slowly sinking into a state of calm, dispassionate observation. At one end of the spectrum, you'd have Bobby Knight, the college basketball coach famous for his red, furious face, and for once flinging a chair onto a basketball court. At the other end, you'd have, the Dalai Lama, or maybe the late Mr. Rogers. On this spectrum, I would be much closer to Bobby Knight than to Dalai Lama or Mr. Rogers. I've never thrown a chair onto a basketball court, but I threw a chicken leg at a dinner guest when I was 4, and a baseball bat at a brother-in-law when I was 12. Happily, my penchant for throwing things at people was waned with age, but the underlying volatility hasn't entirely disappeared. My volatility doesn't smooth the path towards mindfulness. Plus, and perhaps related, there's my attitude toward other human beings, which could get in the way of the metta, or loving kindness, that you're supposed to deploy during a certain kind of meditation. Michael Kinsley, who was editor of the New Republic when I worked there many years ago, suggested, not even half jokingly, that I should write a column called The Misanthrope. Actually, I think that oversimplifies my problem. I don't have a hostile disposition toward humankind per se. In fact, I feel quite warmly towards humankind. It's individual humans I have trouble with. I'm prone to a certain skepticism about people's motivations and character, and this critical appraisal can harden into enduringly harsh judgment. I'm particularly tough on people who disagree with me on moral or political issues that I consider important. Once I place these people on the other side of a critical ideological boundary, I can have trouble thinking generous and sympathetic thoughts about them. On top of this, there's my attention deficit disorder. Meditation is hard enough even if you have normal skills of concentration, and I don't. Here's an interesting thing about this hypothetical spectrum of people ranked from most likely meditators to least likely meditators. The least likely meditators are the people who seem to most need the benefits of meditation. Personally, I think that if the Dalai Lama had never started meditating, he'd still be a pretty easy guy to get along with. I don't think he was born with a lot of rough edges that needed sanding down. So too with Mr. Rogers. Bobby Knight and I are another story altogether. Hence, another paradox of meditation. The problems that meditation can help you overcome often make it hard to meditate in the first place. Yes, meditation may help you lengthen your attention span, dampen your rage, and view your fellow human beings less judgmentally. Unfortunately, a short attention span, a hot temper, and a penchant for harsh judgment may slow your progress along the meditative path. This is bad news for me. But there is an upside to my possessing this rich array of impediments to meditation. They make me a good laboratory rat, a kind of stand-in for the rest of humankind. After all, even if I score higher on these scales than the average person, most people score much higher on them than is optimal. And it may well be that the average person scores higher on them than used to be the case. Technologies of distraction have made attention deficits more common. And there's something about the modern environment, something technological or cultural or political, of all of the above, that seems conducive to harsh judgment and ready rage. Just look at all the tribalism, the discord, and even open conflict along religious, ethnic, and national and ideological lines. More and more, it seems groups of people define their identity in terms of sharp opposition to other groups of people. I consider this tribalism the biggest problem of our time. I think it could undo millennia of movement towards global integration, unravel the social web just when technology has brought the prospect of a cohesive planetary community within reach. Given that the world is still loaded with nuclear weapons and that biotechnology is opening a Pandora's box of new weaponry, you can imagine our tribalistic impulses ushering in a truly dark age. Or maybe I'm getting carried away. Anyway, I'll spare you the full-length, high-volume version of my sermon about our imperiled planet. You don't have to share my apocalyptic fears to think that it would be good for the world if meditation could help more people overcome the mental tendencies that sustain the more belligerent forms of tribalism. And if it can help me overcome them, help me tamp down rage and contemplate my enemies, real and imagined, more calmly, it can help just about anyone overcome them. That's what makes me such an exemplary laboratory rat. I am a walking embodiment of what I consider to be the biggest problem facing humanity. I am, in microcosm, what's wrong with the world. My career as a laboratory rat began in earnest when I went to that retreat in rural Massachusetts in August 2003. I had decided that meditation was worth exploring. But I had learned that casual experimentation wouldn't get a person like me very far. Boot camp was in order, so I signed up for a 7-day retreat at the Insight Meditation Society, auspiciously located on Pleasant Street in the town of, Barr. There every day I would do sitting meditation for a total of 5.5 hours and walking meditation for about that long. As for the rest of the day, when you add 3 silent meals, a 1-hour yogi job in the morning, vacuuming hallways in my case, and listening to one of the teachers give a Dharma talk in the evening, you've pretty much exhausted the day. Which is good, because if there was time you needed to waste, the traditional means of wasting it would be available. I mean, wouldn't be available. There was no TV, no internet, no news from the outside world, and you're not supposed to bring books to read or do any writing. That last rule I secretly broke, so I'd have a record of events. I wasn't planning to write this book at that point, but I'm a writer, and I consider pretty much everything I do grist for my mill. And of course, no talking. This daily regimen may not sound taxing, since aside from the yogi job, it doesn't involve anything we normally call work, but the first couple of days were pretty excruciating. Have you ever tried sitting on a cushion with your legs crossed, focusing on your breath? It's no picnic, especially if you're as bad as focusing on your breath as I am. Early in the retreat, I could go a whole 45-minute meditation session without ever sustaining focus for 10 consecutive breaths. And I know, because I was counting. Time and time again, after I counted 3 or 4 breaths, my mind would wander. And then eventually I'd realize that I had lost count, or in some cases, that I was still going through the motions of counting, but was in fact thinking about something else, and not consciously feeling the breaths. It didn't help that I got mad at myself every time this happened, madder and madder, as the first couple of days wore on. Naturally, my anger then extended to all the people who seemed to be doing better than I was, which is around 80 people. That is, everybody. Imagine being stuck for a week with 80 people who are doing better than you. People who succeed while you fail, or at least succeed in quotations, while you fail in quotations. My big breakthrough came on the 5th morning on the retreat. After breakfast, I consumed a bit too much of the instant coffee I had brought, and as I tried to meditate, I felt that classic symptom of overcaffeination. A very unpleasant tension in my jaw that made me feel like grinding my teeth. This feeling kept intruding on my focus, and after trying for a while to fight the intrusion, I finally just surrendered to it and shifted my attention to the tension on my jaw. Or maybe it wasn't so much shifting of my attention as an expansion of attention, staying conscious of my breath but letting it recede into the background as this annoying jaw sensation moved to center stage. This sort of readjustment of tension, by the way, is a perfectly fine thing to do. In mindfulness meditation, as it's typically taught, the point of focusing on your breath isn't just to focus on your breath. It's to stabilize your mind, to free it of its normal preoccupations, so you can observe things that are happening right now in a clear, unhurried, less reactive way. And things that are happening emphatically includes things happening inside your mind. Feelings arise within you: sadness, anxiety, annoyance, relief, joy. And you try to experience them from a different vantage point than usual, neither clinging to the good feelings nor running away from the bad ones, but rather just experiencing them straightforwardly and observing them. This altered perspective can be the beginning of a fundamental and enduring change in your relationship to your feelings. You can, if all goes well, cease to be their slave. After devoting some attention to the overcaffeinated feeling in my jaw, I suddenly had an angle on my interior life that I'd never had before. I don't remember thinking something like, yes, the grinding sensation is still there, the sensation I typically define as unpleasant. But that sensation is down there in my jaw, and that's not where I am. I'm up here in my head. I was no longer identifying with the feeling. I was viewing it objectively, I guess you could say. In the space of a moment, it had entirely lost its grip on me. It was a very strange thing to have an unpleasant feeling cease to be unpleasant without really going away. This is a paradox here. Don't say I didn't warn you. When I first expanded my attention to encompass the obnoxiously intrusive jaw-grinding sensation. This involved relaxing my resistance to the sensation. I was, in a sense, accepting, even embracing a feeling that I had been trying to keep at a distance. But the result of this closer proximity to the feeling was to acquire a kind of distance from it, a certain degree of detachment, or as some meditation teachers prefer, for somewhat technical reasons to put it, non-attachment. This is something that can happen again and again via meditation. Accepting, even embracing, an unpleasant feeling can give you a critical distance from it that winds up diminishing the unpleasantness. In fact, one thing I occasionally do when I'm feeling very sad, and this is something you can experiment with even if you've never meditated, is to sit down, close my eyes, and study the sadness. Accept its presence and just observe how it actually makes me feel. For example, it's kind of interesting that though I may not be close to actually crying, the feeling of sadness does have a strong presence right around the parts of my eyes that would get active if I did start crying. I had never noticed that before meditating on sadness. This careful observation of sadness, combined with a kind of acceptance of it, does, in my experience, make it less unpleasant. Now, here's a question that is fundamental. Which, if either, of my two perceptions was truer? When the feeling felt unpleasant, or when the unpleasantness subsided and the feeling became, for practical purposes, neutral? To put it another way, was the initial unpleasantness in any sense an illusion? Certainly, by adopting another perspective, I made it disappear. And that's something that's often true of what we call illusions. Shifting your perspective dispels them. But are there any additional grounds for thinking of it as an illusion? This question goes way beyond my own little episodes of transcending over-caffeination and melancholy. It applies in principle to all negative feelings. Fears, anxieties, loathing, self-loathing, and more. Imagine if our negative feelings, or at least lots of them, turned out to be illusions. And we could dispel them just by contemplating them for a particular vantage point, from a particular point of view. Pain that doesn't hurt. There's no doubt that meditation training has allowed some people to become essentially indifferent to what otherwise would have been unbearable pain. In June of 1963, a monk named Thich Quang Duc staged a public protest of the South Vietnamese government's treatment of Buddhists. On a cushion placed in a Saigon street, he assumed the lotus position. After another monk poured gasoline over him, Duc said, "Before closing my eyes and moving towards the vision of the Buddha, I respectfully plead the President Ngo Dinh Diem to make a mind of compassion towards the people of the nation and implement religious equality to maintain the strength of the homeland eternally." Then he lit a match. The journalist David Halberstam, who witnessed the event, wrote, "As he burned, he never moved a muscle, never uttered a sound, his outward composure in sharp contrast to the wailing people around him." Now, you might argue that Duc, far from liberating himself from an illusion, was actually suffering from an illusion. After all, the fact is that he was burning to death. So if he lacked the sensation we normally associate with burning to death, a sensation that carries intense, unbearable pain and triggers alarm that would strike most of us as appropriate, then isn't there some sense in which he wasn't getting the picture? The question I'm circling around, which of our normal feelings, thoughts, and perceptions are in some sense illusory, is important for two reasons. One reason is simple and practical. Obviously, if many unpleasant feelings of anxiety and fear and loathing and melancholy and so on are in some sense illusions, and we can use meditation to dispel them or at least weaken their grip on us, that's news you can use. The other reason is that, at first glance, more academic, but it ultimately has a kind of practical value as well. Figuring out when our feelings mislead us will help us shed light on the question of whether the Buddhist view of the mind and of the mind's relationship to reality is as crazy as it sometimes sounds. Is perceived reality, or a sizable chunk of it, really an illusion? This question takes us into depths of Buddhist philosophy that aren't often plumbed in popular accounts of meditation. Naturally enough, these accounts tend to focus on things with a near-term payoff: stress reduction, boosting self-esteem, and so on, without getting deeply into the philosophical context in which Buddhist meditation arose and within which it has flourished. Using meditation in this way, as a purely therapeutic device that doesn't deeply change your view of reality, is a perfectly fine thing to do. It's good for you, and it will probably be good for the world. Still, using meditation this way isn't by itself taking the red pill. Taking the red pill means asking the basic questions about the relationship of the perceiver to the perceived and examining the underpinnings of our normal view of reality. If you're thinking seriously about taking the red pill, you'll be curious as to whether the Buddhist view of the world works, not just in a therapeutic sense, but in a more philosophical sense. Does this Buddhist perspective, with its seemingly topsy-turvy conception of what's real and what's not, make any sense in light of modern science? That's the question I'll take up in the next chapter, and indeed, in much of the rest of this book. As we'll see, this question, though important on sheerly philosophical grounds, also has implications for how we live our lives. Implications that, though in a sense practical, are probably better described as spiritual than as therapeutic. But first, a word of caution. Strictly speaking, there is no Buddhist view of the world. Buddhism began to split into different schools of interpretation not long after it rose, around the middle of the first millennium BCE. As a result, just as there are Catholic and Protestant Christians and Sunni and Shia Muslims, there are distinct branches of Buddhist thought that differ on particular points of the doctrine. The most basic division in Buddhism is between the Theravada school and the Mahayana school. My own meditative tradition, Vipassana, derives from the Theravada lineage. It is within the Mahayana lineage, to which Kwang Duk belonged, that you find the most radically broad conception of illusion. Some Mahayana Buddhists even subscribe to a mind-only doctrine that, in its more extreme incarnations, dismisses the things we perceive via consciousness as pretty literally figments of our imagination. This strand of Buddhist thought, the strand that most obviously resonates with the movie The Matrix, isn't dominant within Mahayana Buddhism, much less within Buddhism at large. But even mainstream Buddhist thinkers accept some versions of the concept of emptiness, a subtle idea that is hard to capture in a few words, or in many words, but certainly holds, at a minimum, that the things we see when we look out in the world have less in the way of distinct and substantial existence than they seem to have. And then there is the famous Buddhist idea that the self, yourself, myself, the author is saying an individual sense of self, the character or personality, is an illusion. In this view, the you that you think of as thinking of you as your thoughts and your feelings and your body and making your decisions doesn't really exist. If you put these two fundamental Buddhist ideas together, the idea of non-self and the idea of emptiness, you have a radical preposition. Neither the world inside you nor the world outside you is anything like it seems. Both of these ideas would strike most people as dubious, if not crazy. Then again, since the premise of these ideas is that people are naturally deluded, it would seem perverse to let people's natural reactions to keep them, or to keep us from exploring them. This book is in no small part an exploration of these two ideas, and what I hope to show is that they make a lot of sense. Both our natural view of the world out there and our natural view of the world in here, the world inside our heads, these are deeply misleading. What's more, failing to see these two worlds clearly does lead, as Buddhism holds, to a lot of suffering, and meditation can help us see them more clearly. When I say we're going to be exploring the scientific foundation of a Buddhist worldview, I don't mean scientific foundation in the sense of scientific evidence that meditation can reduce suffering. If you want such evidence, there are lots of studies readily available and widely reported that seem to show as much. And I don't mean scientific foundation only in the sense of what's going on in the brain when you're meditating and starting to change your view of reality, though I will, to be sure, get into some of the more important brain scan studies. I mean scientific foundation in the sense of using all the tools of modern psychology to look at such questions as these. Why and in what particular ways are human beings naturally deluded? How exactly does the delusion work? How does delusion make us suffer, if this is true? How does it make us, make us and make other people suffer? Why would the Buddhist prescription for dispelling the delusion, in particular the meditative part of that prescription, work? And what would it mean for it to work fully? In other words, does the elusive state that is said to lie at the culmination of the meditative path, sometimes called enlightenment, really qualify for that term? Would it be like to see the world with perfect clarity? And speaking of the world, is saving the world, keeping the psychology of tribalism from covering the planet in chaos and bloodshed, really a matter of just clarifying the vision of the world's people? I shouldn't say just, because obviously if delusion is deeply ingrained in us, then dispelling it would take work. Still, it would be nice to know if the struggle for enduring peace is also the struggle for truth. As long as we're undertaking a task as Herculean as saving the world, it would be great to kill two birds with one stone. It would also be nice to think that when people pursue the path to liberation, use meditation to try and see the world more clearly, and in the process reduce their suffering, they're helping humanity broadly, and that quest for individual salvation advances the quest for social salvation. The first step in this epic inquiry is to take a closer look at our feelings. Pain, pleasure, fear, anxiety, love, lust, and so on. Feelings play a very big role in shaping our perceptions and guiding us through life. Bigger than most people realize. Are they reliable guides? That's a question we'll start to examine in the next chapter. In Mahayana Buddhism, for reasons I'll touch on in chapter 13, the term emptiness is often taken to include the concept of non-self. But in Theravada Buddhism, non-self is typically treated separately from any broader, a notion that is less prominent in Theravada thinking anyway. Throughout this book, I use the terms non-self or not self and emptiness in a non-overlapping way. Emptiness will be used more narrowly, a Mahayana tradition, referring only to the world out there.